He was told he would be playing a god. That was the promise they gave him when they handed him the armor, polished until it shone like something divine, and the wooden sword painted carefully to look like bronze. It was supposed to be a role, a performance, something temporary. What they didn't tell him was the ending. Because in every version of this myth, the god dies. And in this arena, myths were not stories. They were instructions. When the gates lifted, the light hit him all at once, blinding and violent, like stepping into a world that had no intention of letting him leave. And then came the smell. Not fresh blood, but something older. Something that had been baked into the sand through years of death. Layer after layer, soaked so deeply into the ground that it had become part of the place itself. Behind a second gate, something moved, heavy and alive. One of the handlers stepped back without even looking at him. And in that moment, he understood something was wrong. This wasn't theater, and it wasn't sport, and whatever was about to happen was not meant to be remembered. Because Rome once had a word for spectacles like this, and then, within a generation, they stopped using it. Some performances were designed to happen once and never be written down again. If you want to understand why 50,000 people could sit in those stands and laugh instead of turning away, you have to go back. Not to the beginning of the games, but to the lie that made them possible. The version most people know starts in 264 BC, when two sons buried their father with blood, forcing slaves to fight to the death in what the Romans called a duty to the dead. A ritual that supposedly grew into tradition, then into entertainment, and finally into the system that would define Rome itself. But the problem with that version is that it's too clean, too simple. Even in that first recorded event, something doesn't fit. The location had no structure to hold a crowd, no seating, no stage, and yet thousands appeared as if they already knew what they were coming to see. As if this wasn't the first time blood had been spilled for an audience. Only the first time anyone chose to write it down. When historians later edited those records, quietly adjusting details and removing names, it suggested something more than error. It suggested control. By the 3rd century BC, Rome was not struggling with enemies, but with its own population. Too many returning soldiers. Too many poor citizens packed into collapsing housing. Too much unrest that could not be solved with war. Instead of fixing the problem, the Senate redirected it, turning violence into spectacle. Because if people were watching blood, they were not questioning power, and if they were cheering, they were participating in it. That was the design. The arena was never just about killing. It was about creating a system where obedience felt like patriotism. Imagine sitting there in the morning, the air still cool, vendors moving through the crowd selling food, children laughing. Everything about the day feels normal. And beneath your feet, separated by stone and sand, someone is waiting to die. Hearing the sound of the crowd above him, realizing that the laughter is not separate from what is happening, but part of Italiano. And that is where the story shifts. Because this is no longer about what happened, but why nobody stopped it. And the answer is that nobody believed anything wrong was happening. When the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, the games ran for 100 days. Thousands of animals were killed, but the number itself hides something more important. That kind of spectacle required constant supply. Ships arriving with animals, caravans moving before sunrise. A system operating beneath the surface that turned death into logistics. That same system processed people. Prisoners moved with the same efficiency as the beasts they would face, categorized and scheduled. Some fighters were valuable and trained, kept alive as investments. Others were never meant to survive at all. They were given no real weapons, no chance. Placed into the arena, not to fight, but to lose. To create contrast, to make the courage of others visible. Even the roles people remember differently, like female fighters, were treated as jokes in written history. But physical evidence shows they were real, trained, and far more common than admitted, which means the story we were given is incomplete by design. Midday in the arena was different. It wasn't about entertainment, but about control. Executions were staged, not randomly, but deliberately. Each punishment was tied to a crime. Each death turned into a story that made it easier to watch. When a man was burned alive as part of a myth, he stopped being a person and became a role. And roles are easier to destroy than people. That is what made the system work. Not just the violence, but the way it was framed. Even those who recognized it as cruel saw something more disturbing. A crowd that felt nothing at all. Not horror, not excitement, just acceptance. And beneath the arena, in the dark corridors where prisoners waited, the system revealed its true design. The waiting itself was part of it, listening to what came before, understanding exactly what would happen next, and still leaving behind small mark scratches. Names proof that they existed even when the system was designed to erase them. Evidence found later shows things that were never written down. Bodies marked by both animals and blades in sequences that suggest staging rather than combat. In a civilization that documented everything, the absence of records is not an accident but a decision. Because what this reveals is that the arena was never where Rome lost its humanity. It was where Rome defined who did not have it, drawing a line and making thousands of people agree with it through participation. And that is why it lasted for centuries. Not because it was hidden, but because it was accepted. When it finally ended, it wasn't because people decided it was wrong, but because the empire could no longer afford it. Today, when people walk through the ruins, taking photos and admiring the architecture, almost none of them think about what was built beneath their feet. The system's designed to move blood quickly enough to keep everything running. The man who stepped into that arena at the beginning of this story never had his name recorded, never had his story preserved, because the system was never built to remember people, only the spectacle, and that is the part history almost managed to erase completely. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective on history interesting, consider subscribing for more stories that challenge what we think we know. See you next time. We often think we understand the Roman arena. We picture the roar of the crowd, the clash of swords, the final, dramatic moment. But what if I told you the true story wasn't what happened in the light, but what took place in the darkness below? The deeper truth is that the arena was never just about death. It was about transformation. Before a person was sent into the light, they had already been stripped of something far more important than life itself: their identity. This process didn't begin at the arena gate. It started far below it, in the sprawling underground corridors where time moved differently. Down there, men and women waited, not knowing when their turn would come. All they could do was listen to the sounds from above, the cheers, the screams, the mechanical grinding of hidden elevators, lifting others into the sunlight. Each sound acted as a countdown to their own moment. And in that darkness, something changed. Fear doesn't remain constant. It evolves. It becomes quieter, colder, more precise. What remains is not panic, but a terrifying clarity. The understanding that what is about to happen is not random, but meticulously designed. Every movement, every sound, every second of waiting was engineered to break something inside them long before they ever stepped into the light. The arena above wasn't chaos, it was structure, a very deliberate structure that depended on contrast. You see, trained gladiators fighting each other weren't enough to sustain the illusion. The system required victims. It needed people who would fail, who would panic, who would make the crowd feel powerful and superior. So, entire categories of people were created not to fight, but to be destroyed. This wasn't some dirty secret. It was organized, recorded, and scheduled. This means we're not just looking at cruelty in the moment, but cruelty planned in advance, normalized through repetition, until it no longer felt like cruelty at all. It just felt like procedure. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because it forces us to ask a question not about ancient Rome, but about people, about us. How can something so extreme exist for so long without mass resistance? The answer lies in how the system was designed to feel natural. The audience didn't see themselves as participants in violence. They saw themselves as witnesses to something necessary, something justified, something that reinforced the order of their world. And once that belief is in place, everything else becomes possible. The games didn't desensitize the population by accident. They trained them. Slowly, over time, teaching them where to look, when to react, what to feel. The line between entertainment and execution disappeared completely. And that's why even those who understood the cruelty couldn't stop it. The system didn't rely on ignorance. It relied on acceptance. The archaeological evidence hints at an even darker layer. Beneath the Colosseum, the combination of animal attacks followed by deliberate blade marks on human remains points to a level of staging that doesn't fit any known form of combat or execution. This suggests that certain acts were performed not for survival, not even for spectacle, but for something else, something ritualistic, something experimental, something that the most documented empire in the ancient world chose not to document. And when a system that records everything leaves gaps, those gaps are where the truth often hides. These were not just games. They were a laboratory of control. The longer the games continued, the more they revealed about the structure of Roman society itself. The arena wasn't separate from Rome. It was a reflection of it. It was a place where the hierarchy of life was made brutally visible. Some people were allowed to exist fully, as individuals with hopes and fears. Others were reduced to a function, a role in the grand spectacle. And once a person is reduced to function, their suffering no longer carries moral weight. It just becomes part of the process. This is the psychological mechanism that allowed the games to continue for centuries. Not because people were unaware, but because they had been taught, systemically, not to care. When the system finally began to collapse, it wasn't due to a sudden moral awakening. It wasn't that the Roman people suddenly decided this was wrong. The reason was far simpler. Cost. Maintaining such a massive, elaborate operation required resources that the declining empire could no longer sustain. And so, the games faded away. They weren't rejected as a practice, but abandoned as an expense. They were replaced by cheaper, more efficient forms of control. This means the idea behind the arena, the core principle of spectacular, dehumanizing control, never truly disappeared. It only changed its form. Today, the Colosseum still stands, partially broken, but instantly recognizable. It's visited by millions each year, admired for its incredible engineering, its sheer scale, its history. But the deeper system it represents is rarely acknowledged. It's easier to look at the stone than to think about what it was built to support. It's easier to admire the design than to confront the purpose. And that is why the individuals who were consumed by this machine remain unknown. The system was never meant to remember them, only the spectacle they were part of. And that is the final, chilling truth of the arena. It did not preserve people. It replaced them, again and again, for hundreds of years, until only the structure remained, along with the stories that were created to justify it. If there's anything we should take from this, it's not just shock at what happened. It's the unsettling realization of how easily it was accepted, and for how long it lasted without anyone deciding that enough was enough. Thank you for watching. If this made you think, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories we think we know.